Jordan Peterson is a Harvard and now University of Toronto professor of clinical psychology. He went from being born in a small town to a librarian and a school teacher to becoming one of the best known psychologists in the world and having a YouTube channel with 3 million subscribers. Need motivation?
Watch a top 10 with Believe Nation.
Top 10, I got a top 10. Got my motivation high for my top 10. Gotta learn from the wise women and men. All my life, like na 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 na. For my top 10, top 10, na 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 na. This one's for my top 10.
Hey, it's Carmichael, and I make these videos because you are probably the most ambitious person in your circle, but you know you're capable of more, and you get that push by surrounding yourself with the best. So today, let's learn from one of the best, Jordan Peterson, and my take on his top 10 rules of success. Enjoy. Okay, let's kick it off with rule number 1. Find deep, sustainable meaning.
One of the fundamental theses of 12 Rules for Life and also of Maps of Meaning is that because life is essentially tragic in its fundamental essence, you need a sustaining meaning that's deep and profound, and deep and profound enough to get you through bad times, because there will be very bad times in your life. There'll be death, and there'll be illness, and there'll be disappointment of all sorts. And there'll be just the standard difficulties of life in the world to contend with. And you really must have something that's profound and powerful to set up against that. And I think that your voluntary adoption of the struggle to improve being is the proper antidote to that.
Rule number 2, practice continually.
Of course, you struggle to remember it in your day-to-day life because life is difficult and it's harder to do things than not to do them, and it's harder to do them well than to do them badly. You know, and it's easy to sit around and be hopeless. I don't mean it's emotionally easy, because it's not, but it's procedurally easy to be useless and to fall back into your old habits and to not discipline yourself. And it's a matter of continual practice, slow continual practice. And I think a good example of that is something like weightlifting. You know, if you start a weightlifting program, which I would recommend, by the way, because it's tremendously advantageous physically and cognitively, you're not going to really see results for a number of weeks, and then the results are rather slow, but you can get pretty decent results over a 6-month period and absolutely stellar results over a couple of years. And so you have to make sure your time frame is right and not to be too hard on yourself. And I did mention the future authoring program earlier, and one of the things I would recommend too is if you're having a hard time implementing your decisions, say your ethical decisions, that you spend a bit more time thinking them through and writing them down. And the future authoring program is really helpful for that. That's why we designed it. And so get your goals straight and continue to practice every day. And if you're not succeeding, then make your goals slightly smaller. You want to make your goals large enough so that they challenge you, but small enough so that you have a reasonable probability of succeeding at them on a day-to-day basis. And then you have to also understand that if you fail on a given day, like let's say you're trying to quit smoking and you quit for 2 weeks, and then you have a cigarette and you think, oh my God, now I've screwed it up. I'm not quitting anymore. You smoke a whole pack of cigarettes. It's like, well, there's a couple of mistakes there. And one is, well, just because you had a cigarette doesn't mean you failed. It just means that you had a cigarette. You can start stopping again the next day. And the fact that you had one cigarette in the last 2 weeks is a hell of a lot better than the 2 weeks that you had before that. And so you've got to be realistically humble. You've got to be ambitious enough in your goals so that you're pursuing something that you regard as truly meaningful and worthwhile. You know, and maybe you can judge that to some degree if you think about someone you love attempting the same thing and think about how you would feel if they managed it. And if you would feel good, then that's probably a good what would you say? That would be a good evaluation strategy to use on yourself. So you want your goals to be of sufficient nobility so that you can live with yourself properly if you're pursuing them, but you want them to be small enough so that you have a reasonable probability of implementing them.
Rule number 3, challenge yourself.
I talk to people about taking care of themselves like there's someone who they have responsibility for. And that's not a political issue too. It's an injunction to assuming that you have a certain intrinsic value, and that it's necessary for that value to manifest itself, for you to push yourself against the world, to challenge yourself, because otherwise what you're capable of won't manifest itself. It has to be developed. It has to be called forth by necessity, right? You have to pick a hard problem and try to solve it and push yourself against it and you have to try to do that truthfully and responsibly in order for what it is that you're intrinsically capable of and composed of to come to the forefront. And that seems like a very positive thing as far as I'm concerned, to encourage people to be responsible for themselves and for other people, and also to point out that you have a moral responsibility to do so for yourself just as you do for others. And I think that message has been very helpful to people. At least that's what they've told me. And it's predicated, the rule is predicated on the old Judeo-Christian idea, the oldest idea in some sense, that that there's a relationship between logos, which is truthful speech and communication, and bringing things into being from chaotic potential. That's the idea that's put forward in Genesis. And also the idea that men and women alike are made in the image of God, which suggests that, like God, we have the capability of affecting potential, affecting the possible future and turning it into the actual present, and that we do that, at least in part, as a consequence of our ethical choices.
Rule number 4, live in the truth.
The first proposition, that life is suffering and that we make it worse with our malevolence, I think everyone understands that to be true. But the second is that the best way to confront that is to shoulder responsibility voluntarily and to live in truth. I think those are even more powerful ideas, because you could say that the cure for a malaise or the treatment for a disease is more powerful than the malaise or the disease itself. And if responsibility and truth are antidotes to suffering and malevolence, then that means that they have a power that's transcendent over suffering and malevolence.
Also, if you want to have unstoppable confidence and self-love, check out my 254 series. They're free. The links to join are in the description below.
If you're going to speak effectively, you have to know way more than you're talking about. You have to treat yourself like you matter, because if you don't, then you don't take care of yourself and you become vengeful. Oh no, you're okay. You should feel good about yourself. Like you're fine the way you are. It's like you think, well, that's a calming message for people. It's like, no, it's not.
Rule number 5, structure your day.
You should use a calendar to structure your days, because if you know what you're doing tomorrow, it decreases your anxiety substantially, because you need that kind of structure. You need a pathway. You need to have a map, and you need to know where you're located on the map, and you need to know how you're moving forward. And that gives you hope, because you're moving towards goals that you regard as worthwhile. And it stops you from being anxious, because you're not entirely directionless and lost. And so learning how to manage your time is useful. And you can start with a calendar. You can start with simple things, like you can put in, well, when you're likely to go to bed and when you're likely to get up. And regulating that's useful. That should be relatively ritualistically consistent.
Rule number 6, be over-prepared.
First of all, I try to be over-prepared in some sense. So, I believe that if you're going to give a 20-minute lecture, you should have an hour of material at hand, because that way you have an opportunity to sort of move spontaneously through the material. But generally what I do now, because I have a lot of material at hand, a lot of stories and a lot of things that knowledge that I've accrued over the years, usually before a lecture, and this is the hard part, and I can do a lecture without doing this, but it's better if I do this. This is the hard part. I'll sit down for 20 minutes with my eyes closed, and I figure out what the central topic is. So there's always a question. What's the question I'm trying to address in this lecture? And then I'll figure out a pathway through it. It's like, okay, well, here's the argument. Here's point 1. Here's point 2, here's point 3, and there's possible branches off those. And then with each point, I usually have a collection of stories and facts that I can use to make the point.
Validate the point.
Yeah, and to buttress it and to make it interesting. And so it's a little bit like improvisational jazz, I would say, or even improvisational piano, because I play a little bit of piano. And so you lay out the story, and then you can use the responses of the audience to guide how you're going to walk through it.
Rule number 7, have good ethical structure.
The aims that you have in your life, the ethical aims, and those are the aims that direct your actions, also direct your perceptions, that this is true at a neurophysiological level, and that much of the way that the world manifests itself to you is a consequence of the structure of your ethics. So it's your ethical structure that's instantiated neurophysiologically that serves as an intermediary between the world of phenomena, let's say objective phenomena, and your perception of that. And you see the world through an ethical lens.
Rule number 8, pay attention to yourself.
You know yourself by watching and paying attention. That's why the Egyptians worshipped Horus, the eye, as a god. They knew that attention was important. And the Mesopotamians did the same thing with their god Marduk. It's not thinking exactly. It's not imagination. It's watching like you're a snake. A snake, is a symbol of wisdom in part because a snake is a symbol of many things, but wisdom is one of them. I suppose it's because encounters with snakes that, if they're not fatal, they make you wise. Because a snake watches like cold-bloodedly with no emotional reaction just to see what's there. It doesn't allow, symbolically speaking, doesn't allow what is wanted or desired to interfere with what is observed. So you watch yourself like that, as if you don't know who you are.
Rule number 9, use the memory castle technique.
So I have a theory that I've been working on for a very long time. And what happens when I read something is I plug it into the theory. So I know the full outline of the theory. It'd probably take me 45, 50 hours to lay it out in lectures. I've done that online. But it grows and grows and grows and grows, and I know where to put everything. So if I read something, I think, oh yes, that slot's there. And so
you store it as well. If somebody asks you a question, you need to use that fact. You have it somewhere stored where you bring it in and say, okay.
But it has to be related to this work that I've been doing over time.
Got it.
It's kind of like there's this technique called memory castle that people have used for centuries to remember things. And so what you do is you sit and you imagine might be a place that you know, like a geographic place, a house. And then you can place the things that you remember. Imagine you walk through the house. You can place the things that you want to remember at different locations in the house. Mm-hmm. But you have to turn what you're remembering into an image. And then you can walk through the house and you can lift things up and find what it is that you're trying to remember. I sort of do that with this theory. It's like it's been
interesting.
I've literally worked on it it's been 40 years. And so I know the story and I know its branches, and I keep adding to it and shifting pieces around from time to time.
And rule number 10, the last one before a very special bonus clip, is consult your resentment.
I think a tremendous amount of what you might regard as shadow integration, which in the parlance of behavioral psychologists would be something like assertiveness training, right? It's training in how to stand up for yourself and for your, let's say, for your better self, which would be the self that you could use productively over a medium to long period of time that would be of use to you, but also of use to people around you. So it's a self that's bounded by the necessity of taking care of yourself, but also simultaneously taking care of the people around you. I think that the simplest way to start that work is to consult your resentment. It's easy to become bitter about life and to become angry because, of course, life is difficult and it's full of disappointments. And people are also subject to betrayal on the part of themselves and on the part of people that hypothetically care for them. And so it's easy to get bitter and to be resentful. And resentment is a very useful emotion, even though I think it's one of the most damaging emotions if it's not dealt with properly. So if you're resentful, it basically means only one of two things. It either means you should grow up and quit whining and get on with your life, or it means that you're being subject to tyrannical forces of one form or another, maybe emanating from you, maybe a consequence of the natural environment, maybe a consequence of society. You're being subject to tyrannical forces, and you're not putting your own best interests forward, like in that broader sense that I described. And I don't mean your selfish, narrow interests that only serve the purposes of instantaneous gratification. I mean your own best interests in terms of developing your character over the span of your life. If you're resentful, it either means that you're immature and that you should grow the hell up. And so you need to figure out how much of your resentment is that, and maybe allied with the desire to find other things or people to blame. But the other possible option is that you have something to say or do, right? Because you're in a situation where you're violating your own internal ethical standards, and you're being required, pressured, let's say, to say things you don't believe or to do things that you believe to be wrong. And you need to determine, you need to start to strategize and plan how you can rectify that so that you can say what you mean. Like if you're negotiating with a marital partner, for example, and there are issues in your marriage that aren't making you happy, well, the first thing is you have to take note of that, right? To see that you're actually unhappy. The second is that you have to be willing to engage in a certain amount of conflict, because in order to sort out what's disturbing you, you're going to have to lay your concerns out on the table and say, well, look, this is bothering me. You don't have to say, well, I'm right and you're wrong and you have to fix this. You have to say, well, I've noticed that this pattern of interaction or lack of interaction, say, in our relationship is making me resentful and angry. And the danger of that, of course, is you're going to take it out on yourself and your partner. The danger is passive aggressiveness. You know, you're not going to respond to your partner positively when they do something good if you're resentful about them. And you're not going to respond to yourself properly. And so you have to lay it out on the table, but sort of in a spirit of ignorant humility. It's like, look, I'm frustrated. I'm feeling this way about our relationship. Here's what I think might be going wrong, maybe on my part and maybe on your part. And here's what I envision as a possible solution. That's also really necessary if you're going to say what you have to say, which is to manifest yourself properly in the world. Is you can't just complain about what's wrong. You have to think, well, what would my minimal preconditions for satisfaction be? You have to offer that to the person that you're negotiating with. And so then you learn to abide by the truth to the degree that you can do that. And no one does it perfectly, you know, but it's very useful because you're not storing up a whole sequence of memories about how you were unfairly treated and abused and betrayed. Instead, you're trying to stay on top of it and to note your unhappiness and dissatisfaction when it manifests itself, and to accept that that's the case, and then to analyze that to see if it's your problem, like I said, with regards to maturity, or if it indicates that there's an injustice in the manner in which you and the world are interacting, and then to work to set that right, even in small ways. And so it's a matter of characterological development, and that makes you stronger over time. And partly what you need, you know, in order to do that is you have to really understand, and we do this is why we built, in the future authoring program, we built this section where you have to outline your most dismal future, right? What your future would be like if you let all your bad habits and characterological weaknesses have the upper hand. And the reason we did this is because you can't straighten yourself out merely as a consequence of hope. Let's say you lay out a vision for the future and you think about what your life would be, what you'd like your life to be like. And then that makes you hopeful and it motivates you because it gives you something worthwhile and higher order to work for, right? And that's useful. That's positive emotion working for you, because positive emotion is experienced in relationship to goals. But it's not as useful as also being chased by something you're terrified by. And if you have a good sense of how you'd fall apart if you stayed weak, and just exactly what kind of hell that would be, then when you determine to do something like to tell the truth and to say what you think and to not do things that you hate, then you're going to be pulled along by the purpose that your vision has provided for you, but also pushed along by your desire to avoid the worst forms of hell that you've already outlined for yourself personally. And that can also help you be brave enough to stand up in a situation that would require conflict, because if you have something to say and you have something to negotiate about with someone, then there's going to be a certain amount of conflictual dialogue that accompanies that, right? To lay out a set of problems and to describe the fact forthrightly that those problems characterize a relationship, and then to seek for solutions, is quite stressful in the short term. And it's really easy to avoid. And so people avoid it all the time. And then they store up grievances across the span of their relationships. And eventually the grievances mount to the point where they return in monstrous form and just eat everything up. That's where you get divorces, or that's where you explode at your boss and end up fired, or that's where you develop high blood pressure over 15 years because you can't stand all the accumulated monsters in your closet, and then you drink yourself into oblivion because you can't stand your life. That's all, very counterproductive. But it's easy to avoid that necessary conflict on a moment-to-moment basis because it's very stressful to speak forthrightly about genuine conflicts, especially when you're dealing with important parts of your life. But otherwise, you don't straighten them out, and then you have to carry all that forward. So you need to be terrified of the consequences of not speaking your piece. And that can counterbalance the terror of actually trying to have a conversation.
Now, I've got a really special bonus clip that I think you're going to enjoy. But before that, it's time for the question of the day. I want to know, what was your single biggest takeaway from this video, and what are you going to do to take action on it this week? When you write down what day, what time, and what place you're going to take action on something, you have a 91% chance of following through versus just 35% if you got motivated but never wrote down a plan. And when you share your plan and have public accountability, it raises your chances of following through even higher. So that's what I want to do today for you guys. You watch this video. What was your single biggest takeaway, and what is your plan to take action on it this week? Let me know. Put it down in the comments below.
Long winters in northern Alberta, and not a tremendous amount to do. And well, it's not atypical teenage behavior. That was me in high school. I read all the time.
Oh, you did? So you were reading all the time?
Yeah. I read a book a day for years.
Are you kidding me?
No, most of it was science fiction. I had a neighbor across the street who had a huge science fiction collection, a whole wall, and he used to let me come in there once a week or so, and I'd pick like 7 or 8 books and take them home and read them, and then I'd come back and get another 8. I read science fiction like that, I don't know.
From what age?
10 probably.
1 a day?
Yeah, that was my goal.
If you want to change your life for free in the next 30 days, check the link right here below me. Or if you want 10 more awesome rules from Jordan Peterson, check out the video right there next to me. I think you'll enjoy them. Continue to believe, and I'll see you there.